Okay, friends, we're going to get started in a few minutes. Just some things to note. This session will be recorded. We'd like to share it with our greater campus community. And for students, if you can, please put your first and last name, because I would love to give you credit for being here. But if there are two Toms, I would like to know which Tom was here. Okay, friends, we're going to get started. I'll be moderating the talk today. So first off, welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. Christy will be introducing our lovely speaker who has joined us today, and we'll do about 45 minutes of a conversation and then the last 15 minutes for Q&A. Okay, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Christy McMorris. I am the Dean of Bard Academy at Simon's Rock, and I have the honor this evening of introducing our keynote speaker. Julia Golden has worked in student affairs for over 12 years and is the Associate Dean of Students and Student Affairs at Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Science University in Boston, Massachusetts, serving as a dean for the Boston, Worcester, and Manchester campuses. As dean, Julia has led diversity initiatives, trainings, as well as the Department of Residence Life. Spearheading and overlooking the university-wide food and financial insecurity task force, Julia was able to create a food pantry and emergency fund to support students on campus. Julia also created healing groups for marginalized students and helped implement implicit bias training for the Division of Student Affairs. Julia loves developing policies, building unique and creative workshops in leadership, social justice, and storytelling. Their passion for social justice while honoring intersectionality and self-reflection is what inspires and motivates their work within higher education. Julia feels these are crucial tools to create institutional and cultural change. Julia holds a Bachelor of Arts in History and Sociology from the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth and a Master of Education from Springfield College. Currently, Julia is studying at University of Massachusetts in Boston for the Doctor of Philosophy in Higher Education. Go ahead, Julia, go ahead. Julia's research includes secondary racial traumatic stress, examining how higher education may honor first responders of color who respond to racial discrimination and injustices. Julia feels it is important we examine how we care for professionals of color, as higher education was never meant to support people of color. Julia is an innovative leader. Julia was the first queer person of color to create a national trans and queer person of color safe zone training with the help of TQPOC scholars across the nation. Julia serves on the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators, NASPA, Region 1 Advisory Board, where they created the inaugural Social Justice and Equity Coordinator position and serves on the NASPA Region 1 Conference Committee. Julia is the founder and dreamer of the award-winning Ubuntu Institute of NASPA Region 1 in hopes of creating a pathway for student affairs professionals of color into leadership at NASPA and in higher education. Julia asks others, why bring a seat to the table when you can make your own table? Okay, now I had the opportunity to get to know Julia this year at a webinar where they developed to share their experiences and knowledge as a leader in diversity education. What I discovered in that webinar is that Julia teaches with an open heart, modeling for each of us that learning happens where there is trust. Learning happens where there is community. Learning happens when someone believes in your innate ability to be all that you are and all that you never knew you were capable of. So thank you, Julia, for the opportunity to be your student, and thank you for joining us this evening as our keynote speaker.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. That was a really lovely introduction. I definitely try to speak with my heart, and that's what I hope to show and share with all of you tonight. Thank you so much for you all to be here. I recognize that Zoom is a certain energy that we all have to really pay attention and put a lot of energy, more so than maybe we expected to. So I thank you for being here tonight, and I know many more will view this and recording. As I know for me, there are so many webinars I would love to attend, but I know sometimes my energy feels a little lower, right? And that's okay. So thank you so much for those of you who could be with here tonight. I do have a PowerPoint presentation I want to show you through, as I like to share stories with people. And to me, storytelling and sharing my stories is really going to be the best way that I could connect with others. So I'm going to go ahead and share that screen with you all. Give me 1 second. Okay, so a little bit about this topic and what it has meant for me. Let's see, 1 second. Make sure that's... So when I talk about honoring my voice, I want to acknowledge what a privilege it is to have a voice. I think a lot of times it sounds like a simple topic that everyone should be able to speak and speak their mind, and that they feel comfortable speaking about who it is that they are. But that's not always the case. And as someone who works at a college and as a dean who advocates for my students, I recognize that often so many people come to college or into their educational experiences not knowing who they are and not knowing where they want to go with their life. And that's great, actually. That means that you're at the prime of being able to understand who you are and think about what you can be. But it often feels very scary and vulnerable to arrive in your education and be like, I'm just not sure if I understand truly how I'm going to react to all of this in school, or if I'm ready to kind of get to know others. It's very scary. Or maybe for some of you, it's about understanding your values and how they differ from your parents' values. That's also very scary. And some of your parents might be like, wow, this is a lot, right? It's a lot to see my child go away to school or be a part of a school and not know the day-to-day. So all of that can be a lot for people. And I think that that's something I just want to acknowledge. So honoring a voice, because it's not always so simple to have a voice. I also want, before we get started completely, I also want to do a land acknowledgement. Simon's College, I believe, from what I understand, is on the land of the Mohican people. And I want to just put that out there. Land acknowledgements are very important, that we honor the Native Americans who originally had the land in which our institutions are built upon. So knowing the history of your institution is so important, right? So many amazing values and traditions, but knowing the land and where it came from is also equally important as part of that history. The land of the Mohican people, and for some of you, you might be zooming from other parts of the country or places, and think about that. Take 1 second to think about whose land was this originally. For some of you, you actually might be of the land and might have originally been yours, and that's amazing. And that in itself is an amazing feat. So just always like to do land acknowledgements. I also want to acknowledge again, I recognize people learn in many different ways. And I hope that I tried to write a lot of text on some of the PowerPoints so people could follow along with my story as I tell it. So who am I? In other words, why listen to me? What do I have to offer you? I'll tell you a little bit about who I am, the identities that I lead with. And, one of the first things I asked about in this presentation, I said, what would we like to really focus here on? And I think one part that's really important to look at is intersectionality. Intersectionality, just a quick definition, is talking about how you can have various identities and sometimes they can cross one another and sometimes you have to be separate. The original terminology comes from Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a Black woman lawyer, who talked about how she navigates the world as a lawyer, as a Black person, and then as a woman. And, not always being able to be in one room as Black and a woman and a lawyer. So living separate lives, and wouldn't it be amazing if we could just be in one place? So intersectionality offers a sense that maybe you are saying, well, you know what, my identities include my spirituality, they might include my age, they might include some part of a value I have. It could be sexuality or gender. So intersectionality allows us to talk about all of the ways in which we can be and how they intersect with one another, but also at times when they have to silence one another, which is painful. But intersectionality originally did come from a Black woman who was really trying to understand how she could talk about her Blackness and her being a woman and her specific career of being a lawyer. So I always want to make sure we give shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw. Then I talk about, for me, not only do I have so many different identities I'm balancing, the first one that was really relevant to me in my life was being a transracial adoptee. Some people may never have heard that term before. I want to put it out there. That term only became one in about 2002 to 4. And what it means is, while I identify as Latinx, specifically Honduran, my family is actually white and they adopted me. And I'll go into that story in a little bit. But I think it's important to understand a lot of the way I attempt diversity work is actually has a lot to do with my transracial adoption. I do identify as queer, and I recognize generationally the term queer can be offensive to some people. So I just want to put out there that you can also say LGBTQ, and I'll try my hardest to interchange that language. But I say queer only in the sense of, for me, it's a very comfortable word, as I don't have to necessarily label my sexuality and gender differently. I do identify as non-binary. For me, queer is an all-encompassing word, but I do understand the origins of it, and I understand, and wanting to respect my LGBTQ elders, it's important to understand the history within that word. I said, as I mentioned earlier, I identify as Honduran, which is a country in Central America. I've had the chance and the honor to visit it several times in my life. I'm also an educator. So I've chosen the career of being an educator and being a college dean specifically. I, at 20, decided I really wanted to one day be an assistant dean who overlooked conduct processes. I had a mentor at college who really inspired me. And now I'm an associate dean who overlooks all of deans of students. And it's really exciting for me to have that. For me, it's about really giving back to college age adults. And I'm also a researcher. And the reason I used to not talk about this identity a lot, but there are not very many Latinx and queer individuals who not only have a master's in education, an MBA, and as well as attempting a PhD. And, you know, for me, my education has allowed me to think about not only my voice, but reflect on it. And I hope that your education gives you that opportunity as well. So these are a little bit of my identities and how I navigate this world. And it's important you understand that, because then you'll understand where maybe my story gives me points of resiliency and how I've grown as a person. So let's take it back to 1983, 84. I was actually born in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. It is the capital of Honduras, and especially in the 80s and 90s was a very scary city to be in, full of a lot of unfortunate violence that could do anything with drugs, poverty. There's a lot of gangs there that can happen. And currently we see a lot of immigrants from Honduras specifically trying to make their best way and their best lives coming to the United States out of actual fear from gangs. And it's a very scary instance. And I've had the chance to serve many Central Americans in the Boston area who've tried their best to come to the United States just to be alive and be able to live the best life they can for them and their families. And so for me, it's definitely, I had a chance in being adopted. I had a chance to really, I don't think my education would be what it is if I hadn't had the ability to not only, once I was adopted, pursue an education and be supported, you know, financially in an education. I really had a privilege in that. However, I think one thing that is really important to me is that I do identify someone as an immigrant because I am the first in my biological family to be in this country and to be serving the education I have. So oftentimes for me, it's really important that I acknowledge the fact that, you know, being from Honduras, everything I do as far as my education, as far as my career, is how do I serve others? Because if I hadn't been given this chance, I think for me, a lot of it, it's, you know, a lot of who I am would have been lost. And I think it's important for me to honor and acknowledge the sacrifices my biological family gave, as well as my family who adopted me has done a lot for me to support me and love me. So it's really important that I acknowledge all those individuals and know that I will never take advantage of the opportunities I've been given. I also know, though, that everything I've done it with love and honor. And that's important for me to kind of think about how I lead. And that's something, the root of me is also knowing too, that you can have very different identities in your family. My father's Russian Jewish, my mother's Irish Catholic, my sister's biological to them. We all are very different and grew up very in different ways. My parents are of socioeconomic background is blue collared, and the way they grew up is very different than the way my sister and I grew up. And yet in this family of four, while we may have had different life experiences and have navigated this world very differently, there's something that has always remained as a first lesson that I think I have developed my conversations with. And the way I work with people, I learned this lesson very early in life. You don't have to share identities to love one another. Having hard conversations is okay and needed. And if there's anything that I leave this conversation with you all about, now more than ever in this nation, we really need to offer one another some more grace. We are all coming from very different backgrounds. That's actually the beauty of America, right? But we often don't give the chance to hear one another out. And I think the hardest part about doing diversity work now is people hear me say I work on diversity and they think you're trying to change my mind. And here's the biggest secret that people don't understand. Only you can change your mind, and only you can decide what is true as a value to you. I can never go into your life and say, you're wrong and this should change. Only you can decide what you want to learn from me. And if you're willing to hear my perspective, I'm grateful for it. But only you can decide whether you'll take pieces of knowledge from me or whether you'll disregard it and say, you know what, that doesn't serve me. Because you only have the power to change the way you look at this world. I cannot change this world and the way you look at it. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that. Take on that power, but also acknowledge that as you know that only you can change your mind, then maybe you'll be more willing to listen to people's stories, not their politics, maybe not even about some of the things that they might say that seem harmful. Put that aside. What's the story? Why do they feel this way? Some of the people I have met who have been so adamant and how they think, there's usually a reason as to why they think that way. And when you take all of these questions away and you just sit there and say, what is it? How do we connect? You often find that, well, the thing we're talking about and disagreeing about, the reason my value is so rooted in X, Y, and Z is because it comes from family, because it comes from my religion, because it comes from the way I view, this and that, and how I was raised. And so I think, it's important to understand, I may never know what it's like to walk in your shoes. And trust me, I only have the shoes that I have created, right? But that at some point, if I take a second to really understand, I might realize, okay, we are nothing alike. We're never going to agree on certain things, but it doesn't mean I have to disregard you. It doesn't mean I have to make you invisible or your voice invisible. We can both live and we can both be. But at least we took a chance to try and attempt a conversation. I also say this to others too. I say, remember, no one deserves your story. So honor your own story, right? Just because I'm trying to have a hard conversation with someone, if at some point I'm realizing we're no longer being productive, okay, it's time that I appreciate that we had the chance to talk, but this is probably no longer serving either one of us. And that's okay. At least we tried it. You know how many conversations are never even attempted because we feel so awkward? And that's my biggest challenge for my students right now is critically thinking and understanding that, okay, even if this person isn't going to change, remembering that's not the point. The point isn't to change each other. The point is to share parts of who you are and understand you are not for everyone in this world. And some people will never understand your story or be able to honor your story, and that's okay. And the people you meet in life who can hold that for you, amazing. But at least you tried. And at least you tried to share your story, your perspective, and at least you had a conversation. I think of all the conversations I wish I had more so, but I think I'm doing better as I've gotten older and realized I'm not for everyone, not everyone's for me. But let's keep trying. Let's keep trying to have these hard conversations. And I'm very grateful that my family and I, there's been many years where here and there, there's been some hard conversations about race, about socioeconomic status, about many different things, spirituality. But we've always been able to say at the end of the day, let's hear each other out. And I think that's what I really value about my family is that even when I've met people, I'm like, I'm not sure I'm ready to talk to them. I try until it harms me. I really do try. So I think that that's a big lesson I learned from that. I also want to put out there that chosen family is very, very big for me. Chosen family is someone or the people, and this comes from a queer lens as well. Sometimes when people come out, or they try to come out, we just had National Coming Out Day, right? October 11th. And not everyone has a success story. I was closeted for 7 years, had a very hard time coming out. I also was growing up as a teenager in a different time. It was before It Gets Better campaigns. It was historically not a great time when I was trying to come out. And I think it was something that took me a very long time to outwardly say, you know, I'm LGBTQ and I'm proud of this. And when I finally came out, I recognized that some people in my life did not know how to hold that again. But I was able to find some people in my life who did know how to hold that. And that's some of the people in this picture here are some of my closest friends and who I consider family. And I've met some of these friends over 15 years ago, and some of these friends are newer in my life in the past 2 to 3 years. But what I understand is that each and every person, we have something in common, and a lot of it has to do with resiliency. We've learned that life has not always been the nicest, but we're going to overcome this, and we're going to have a chance to be family. And when I have a hard time processing, or if I need something as a resource, or if I'm career-wise looking to have some, you know, perspective that I'm not understanding, it's very helpful to have people outside of your family to help you along the way. And I think one of the pieces I wanted to share with you art-wise, this is a piece on the right. It's one of the first times I walked into the Brooklyn Museum about a year ago with my sister. And I walked and I saw on the wall is a large picture. And this picture was looking right at me. And it was all of these, as I like to call it, queer trans people of color. It's cutie POC, or now people say trans queer people of color, so TQ POC, but cutie POC is commonly said. So I look in this museum and there's this amazing portrait, cutie POC folks, so queer people of color who look very happy and vibrant and are having fun, and just that feeling of family. And I remember thinking, this is the first time I've ever gone into a museum and seen a picture or a painting or a graphic that represents me and looks like me and reminds me of what it is to be. And I think that brought a lot of emotion to me, because I remember thinking, why did I have to wait to 35 years old to see a piece of art in a museum that reflected me? But feeling very grateful nonetheless, and being excited that I remember sharing it with all my chosen family, be like, look what I found, this is an amazing piece, and loving this piece very much so. And so again, chosen family to me is something very valuable. Remember, family is not always blood. Family are those people who accept you for who you are and love you deeply. And I recognize there's some people on this webinar, will be on this webinar, who they may not know which of their values from their family they'll take on. And some of you might not have the greatest relationship with the family, but recognize that those things you process over time. And remember, there are so many people out in this world, more than you can imagine, who are going to have similar values as you. And you're going to be able to say, wow, we have a lot in common. And you'll develop a bond with people that you would never expect to. And you recognize more and more there are people out there who are going to see you for exactly who you are, and honor your voice. And I remember thinking, especially in the past couple of years, of really wanting to make sure I spent really quality time with those who would lift my voice up. So always be aware, think of the people in your life who support you and love you. Thank them, right? Thank them for that. But also think about surrounding yourself with those people in the hardest of times. There are a lot of life moments I've had where I don't know, I would have been successful and I would have found my way, because I always will. But it's always nice to know I have people I can count on and be with, who will celebrate me and love me. And I think that's really important. I think this is where resiliency and the cutie POC lens for me, comes a little bit, this is where I pop off a little bit when I talk about, I found this Viola Davis quote and I just loved it. And it said, let them judge you, let them misunderstand you, let them gossip about you. Their opinions aren't your problem. You stay kind, committed to love, and free in your authenticity. And no matter what they do or say, don't you dare doubt your worth or the beauty of your truth. Just keep on shining like you do. I'm not going to sit here and say every part of my life has been hard. I've had beautiful moments in my life, but there have been a lot of barriers I've had to overcome, and especially through education, right? But there are things that I've learned, as a transracial adoptee, I've had to code switch a lot, meaning that I've had to really make sure that those who were white around me, and I grew up in a 92% white neighborhood, I really had to make sure, I was always trying to please others and make sure people felt comfortable around me. And at some point at 25, I was like, I can't do that. I'm Latinx. I want to just be who I am, and I'm never going to look back from that. So I think for me, code switching was something that I would no longer do. unless it was survival, purely survival, not to comfort people. As someone who's closeted for 7 years, that's some of the darkest times. I'm very happy for the younger generation who's so able to be out. And I recognize that still some cannot be out. But for those who are able to be, that's such a freedom. And I wish I could have experienced that as young as some of you have been able to. But I will say that being closeted allowed me to understand that who I was, and that while I was going to take some time to fully be myself, once I did come out, I never looked back. I really never did. As a person who felt like I had to hide parts of my gender expression and who I was gender-wise, I just know myself. I can no longer sacrifice who I am. I have to have this voice. And it's not just about my voice being silent just for my sake. It's that I never, ever want for any of my students who identify as Latinx, LGBTQ, one or the other, or both, to ever feel like they're silenced, especially in their education, but also personally. You cannot academically thrive if you are certainly waiting just to survive. I know my GPA from the time I was closeted to the second I came out. I literally went from being a C- student to an A+ student on the honors society. And that's true. I remember if you look at my transcript for UMass Dartmouth, it was like, who is a student? Are they even trying anymore? And then you see, as soon as I come out, my grades went skyrocketing because I believed in myself and I loved myself and I was ready to try because I could focus on school because no longer was I scared. And I think authenticity is how I try to really lead. It's the main value for me of being Cutie Latinx as a person. And I always talk about this picture because my sister showed it to me for the first time. I had no idea this picture existed. She found it at my parents and was like, I love this picture because it's your fake smile. And even as a baby, you had a fake smile. I was laughing. I was like, thank you very much for sharing this picture. I hope that you don't put this on Instagram. Thank you very much. But I really appreciate it because I always think about, again, I think a lot of times I have a very loud laugh. I'm someone who loves humor and lead with humor sometimes. And I think part of it is because I have joy and because it took a lot to get joy, that I'm very appreciative of joy. And I hope that you all think about what joy means for you and what brings you joy. At the end of the day, the strongest tool you have is your voice and your story. And I think that that is what I want you to learn today. Some of my story might feel similar to yours. Some of my story, you might say, you know what? My life hasn't exactly been like yours and here or there, but I feel parts of it. And when you speak, I feel some resemblance. But I think part of this, and this is the hardest part, historically, marginalized voices have been erased from history. There are so many people we will never know about because history specifically erased stories. And so it's very important that you remember you are the author of your story, that no one knows your full story but you, and that sometimes the strongest tool that you have are the values and the story that you uphold and you bring forward in life. I think a lot of times I look back at, again, as my career as a dean, it doesn't shock me that I'm someone advocating for marginalized students. I'm trying to be the role model I really truly wish I had growing up. I didn't have Latinx role models. And I think if I had, I think it would have been very different. I certainly did not have any out, I should say. I'm sure I had LGBTQ elders and folks and role models in my life, but no one was out. Representation matters. And what if you get to be that representation for somebody else? I've had so many people say to me, Julia, I never had anybody say a part of a story like you just mentioned. I've never heard my story through somebody else. And when they heard that part of the story, it was almost like, I'm not alone. And so for me, storytelling isn't just about me putting out my feelings. It's me allowing for folks to connect to me on different levels and knowing that maybe for a moment, we're not alone. And maybe for a moment and not being alone, we can find out what more we have in common. It's giving people a chance to connect. And again, I really worry sometimes that we don't offer authentic connection beyond screens. When's the last time you talked to someone face to face and said, how are you? How are you doing today? I've been thinking about you. And just saying a quick hello, right? I think moments like that, we often just put aside. So I think these are the reasons I share my story. And I want to go a little bit into what this means for some of the things I've been researching and putting it in practice, okay? Because we can always talk about stories. The stories are so magnificent, how they can align us together. However, people will ask me, well, we need more than stories. What does this all mean? So why I study this? I study something called racial battle fatigue. It's a phrase that is coined by William Smith. He works in higher education and also talks a lot about psychology and explains that the physical and mental fatigue comes from racial microaggressions. Some of you might be familiar with racial microaggressions. Also, microaggressions in general don't just have to be about race. They can be about age. They can be about sexuality and gender. They can be about spirituality. They can be about how someone, whether they have physical or visible or invisible disabilities or abilities. And so it's very important to know microaggressions, really what they are is these everyday comments that someone says to you, these slights that you come back thinking, did someone just insult me or what's happening? That comment didn't feel okay. And so what we find is a lot of times people will say, microaggressions, that's too sensitive. Why are you being so sensitive? But Boston University actually did a study a couple of years ago where they showed that microaggressions actually change the brain map and can change the brain physically. And one of the things that I study is how racial battle fatigue based on microaggressions over time, these are creating not only mental fatigue, but physical and physiological fatigue of your body. So one of the things I'll put out there is for me, if I'm a student, I'm in the classroom and I hear a teacher or a professor saying a microaggression of some sort, well, now I'm going to think, well, will this professor or teacher support me in other ways? Will my grade ever be in jeopardy if they say something and now I feel like someone is judging me? Did my peers who are laughing at this moment understand that this is personal to me? I'm having to think about all of this and still maintain my academic career and be okay academically. And so what happens to a student in a classroom, and this could be in the classroom, this could be in the halls of a class or halls of a school. If for those who not understanding how maybe folks live on campus or not, or have in the past, it's whether you live in residence halls or one day will live in residence halls, anything on a campus, right? If you're hearing microaggressions surrounding you, what does that mean and what does it lead to? It means that students of marginalized identities, those who have identities where they're not of the majority, they're not of those of who have power and a voice to have power. It means that they might self-censor themselves. So now in a class, I'm going to stay quiet. I'm not going to share my opinions or my ideas or my stories because I feel silly or vulnerable. And I feel like I can't share who I am because when I spoke up or when someone like me spoke up, a microaggression was said and now I have to shut down. I might question my ability. Well, if my peers are laughing at this or if they're asking me a question that is based on a microaggression, or if they're saying, oh, you only got into this classroom because you're X, Y, and Z, or you only got into this school because of X, Y, and Z, I might say, wow, am I really supposed to be here right now? And that actually leads to something called imposter fatigue. Imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is where I keep wondering, am I supposed to be here? You can get this at work, at school, you can get this in other forms of your life where you're like, I really want to be here, but I'm not sure I'm good enough to be here. And so you start wondering who you are and if you're good enough to be somewhere. It took me way too long in my life to understand this simple sentence. I am enough. That's a sentence. I am enough, period. And I hope all of you have that moment when you realize I've always been enough. And maybe you haven't had that moment yet and you're still doubting some of who you are, and that's okay. It takes a long time. And some of your parents might be like, listen, I'm still trying to figure this out. But to be able to sit here and say, I am enough is very powerful. And so understanding that racial battle fatigue can take that from you, of you wondering, am I enough? Sometimes you're adapting the rules and norms just to get by. Sorry, it says adopting, I should say adapting. You have to adapt sometimes in ways you didn't want to because you're just trying to survive a situation. And socialization of student leadership is one way that can help with racial battle fatigue. And we'll go into that in 1 second. But really what I'm questioning is, in what ways? So when a student is new to a school, how do we show them that we want to have equity talks, that we want to talk about, we care for them, and we are genuinely wanting to hear their authentic voices? How do we set that up? And that's for teachers and professors to think about. What am I doing to set a student to be successful and honoring their voice. When they share their story, do I understand how vulnerable they feel? And am I honoring that? And as for students, what are you doing to hear your peers? When your peers are sharing, information about themselves, what are you doing to show support? And if you don't agree with them, that's okay. And how can you have a conversation on that? I know I've had students be like, hey, can we talk after class? I kind of see where you're coming, but I don't really get it. Asking questions is okay. And in student leadership, all of you might have those opportunities to really think about in your sense of leadership, how do I create space and places for people to be authentic? And I think that that's something I really challenge my student leaders at MCPHS to really think about in how I present programs and projects and moments that happen over socially. How are we offering this opportunity for everyone, if possible? Why are we discussing this? Because now this is more maybe specific to, in some cases, the statistics colleges are showing is that bias reports are going up nationally, meaning that we're having more and more microaggressions and more incidents happen where hate incidents are happening on college campuses nationally, and they're increasing. That again, this can happen, I'm certain, in any types of institution where students are fighting about things verbally perhaps, or people are not taking screenshots of, they said this on Instagram, they said this on Snapchat, this is homophobic, or this is racist, this is ableist. And instead of just talking to each other one-on-one, they're just showing the Snapchats to their administration and being like, this is a problem, but can you work on it? And I'm like, and always as a dean, I'm like, this is a problem and I will validate you, but did you have a conversation with your peer first? And they're like, I don't want to. I know it's awkward, but here's how we can do it. And we'll work through a script and work and making sure that they feel like they can really have a hard conversation. So I'm always being sure that you can think about how to do that. Because if you can't, remember, if you're creating an environment where people are so worried about surviving, they're not gonna be able to thrive. And it's important. You're in school for a reason. You're here to be successful in your life and your career. And if you don't have that foundation of feeling like I can just be, you may not be able to academically survive. I work in a lot of food and financial insecurity efforts where students don't even know where their next meal's coming from. They don't know where they're gonna get school supplies. And yet they wanna be a doctor one day so they can do the best they can for their families and bring it forward and pay it forward. And so I think a lot of those students are saying, I have to make sure your basic needs are met so you can make sure that you can academically thrive and focus on school. That's my goal. So again, I want to make sure that students are thinking about what does it look like to heal? And you might say, Julia, I didn't even know I was hurt. But maybe as I'm talking about these things, you're really like, wow, there's a lot of things I haven't considered. And that's okay. And as we reflect, part of reflection is how we get to healing. It's how we understand, you know what, there are parts of me that I have never even thought about. And that's actually beautiful because now you have a chance to reflect and think about what does it look like for the future and how you are as a person. So self-care tips, this is something I really want to encourage all people to think about is one, there are ways to really make sure that you're taking care of yourself. Again, I never want anyone to feel bad for me. I'm not here for a sob story, for a pity party. I don't have time for that for myself. What I do want people to understand though, is that I have to take care of myself and love myself first. And then I can let others in, and then I can let others build, and then I'm community-based, right? As someone who's Latinx, community is everything. For me, familia is everything. And I can't do those things unless I'm taking care of myself. I can't show up for others or help others unless I take care of myself first. And that's a privilege because not everyone has the opportunity to just take care of themselves first, but we have to try. And I think one of the things I want to mention is how we decolonize self-care. Self-care is not just going to a spa, although I love that. It's not just going to a spa and you getting a massage. Self-care sometimes is me saying, I want to take a moment to just think my ancestors and where they came from and how they have impacted where I am right now. And I want to thank them for where I'm going to be going, because every single person, whether they're biological or whether they're family in other ways, has had it be so that I am exactly where I am right now because I stand on the shoulders of others. And so for me, there's lots of ways we can look at self-care. And there's a lot of research currently right now that talks about self-care is not just this capitalistic thing, it's also how we simply reflect and simply be. So self-care could be anything from, at Simon's Rock, do you have affinity groups on campus or at your institution? Are there moments and places that people who look like you, are like you, can be honored? And maybe that's not there yet, but if there are, that's amazing. And if there aren't, what's the opportunities to help build something? I love to tell student leaders, what is your legacy? When you leave these college campuses or these halls, what do you want to be known for and what's going to be left behind? Because we all have that opportunity to leave a part of ourselves. Saying no to extra projects or discussions that do not serve you. So here's the thing. I know I said earlier, be open to other perspectives. Yes, but remember, ask yourself what boundaries you are putting around discussions. I always say to myself, I am the dean of everyone, which means I am the dean of people, whether they look like me or they don't, whether they identify like me or they don't. I could have a student who could see me and not want to work with me, and I am still their dean and I have to show up for them because it's my career and my job, but it's also because it's a chance for us to connect, and maybe in some way they'll recognize that wasn't so bad. And you'd be surprised how many students I've said, I was really intimidated to come to you, and then I realized you were very easy to talk to. So I think for me, it's saying, I always say to myself, I will spend X amount of time with someone, and at some point I'll check in with myself and say, did this conversation serve me and that person? And if it did not, I can say, thank you so much for working with me. I appreciate it. Sounds like, we've resolved what we could, and now it's time to move on. And I appreciate it. And if you ever want to talk again, let me know. And then I can evaluate, do I want to talk to that person again? And can I? Now, it's very different if it's a job or if it's a position you have where you have to talk to someone. But in general, outside of that, and in school, are there ways that you can say, how can I honor my time and someone else's time? I also think it's important to know you're not the only person that has to speak up. Sometimes student leaders, I've noticed, and myself, and I was one of these student leaders, I thought I'm the only person who can make a difference on this campus or this institution or this school. I even did this in high school. I remember saying, I'm really upset about the racism I saw in the classrooms or in the hallways. And I remember thinking, am I the only one who's seeing it? Probably not. I might be the loudest voice, but I'm not the only voice. And so asking yourself, who in this community can help me? How can I create a community on this? Because there's more power in numbers at the end of the day. So recognize you're also going to graduate from the institution you're from. So who is going to lead these efforts after you're gone? It cannot just be up to one person to make a difference. We have to think about the change takes time and it takes generations to create real change. So how do we start change? And how do we pass it on? And how do we lead through that change and know that we just had the opportunity to leave a little piece of ourselves through this idea of change and pass it on to the next people be after us? I think that's really important. Also, what are you doing outside of school? For me, it's not just something as simple as right now, I know we're in COVID, and I want to acknowledge that this pandemic has hit many marginalized populations in ways that I can't even fathom. Statistically, we can look at specifically how the queer and Latinx communities have been very much targeted, has targeted COVID, but I also know there's a high percentage of Black Americans and African Americans as well. And there's many other communities that we could talk about. But I think what we do want to understand though, is what are you doing outside of school and your homework and your peers? Do you ever have a moment just to be and to give yourself a chance to recharge? As I mentioned, it's not just me as an individual. There are families who have sacrificed a lot right now for us to learn and be on Zoom. There are families who are just having a hard time right now. And so I understand that self-care and taking time for ourselves feels selfish sometimes. I think also in the immigrant lens, self-care often feels like, am I allowed to have time to myself? So I want to recognize that this is very hard to just say, when do I have time to just be and reflect? But what I do know is if you have a marginalized identity, if you don't take the time to just give yourself a chance to recharge, you will burn out. And that's what my research is showing. And that's what racial battle fatigue specifically shows. If we don't take the time to recharge or find community, we will burn out. And it's important that we acknowledge that. How can you ask your peers to share in this work? This is a talk maybe that centers the voices of marginalized people, but I cannot be here without my white allies and advocates. My own parents are white. We've had many conversations that are very hard about race. You try telling your parent, guess what? That was racist what you did. I've had to do that. It's not comfortable, it's not fun, but we've had those conversations. But the thing is, they trusted me to have that conversation with them. And I trusted them to have that conversation with them as well. There's a certain amount of trust that we have to have these hard conversations. And I think part of it is we have this thing that right now it's Black and white or different ages or LGBTQ or not. And the media really likes to show these isolated incidents, right? And I just want to put it out there. It's really important that you ask yourself, not only who can share the work with me, but who are people who are not of my identity that can share this work with me. I'll give a quick example on this. I had a meeting that was very important about a policy I created. And we have a certain board, and many of the people on the board are cisgender white older men. It's just who happens to be on our board. And I can tell you historically why that might be. But I went into that meeting knowing, okay, I'm cutie Latinx, I'm non-binary. I know the way I come off and saying this policy is needed might seem biased to them. And I said to my colleague who identified as white, male, cisgender, he loves talking about how Italian he is, and I love that. And I said to him, I was like, listen, I might need a little bit of your support and help in this meeting. Do you think you could help me? And he's like, I had a feeling that you might need my support. And I'm excited that I feel really lucky that you asked me for that. And I have some ideas already. And I was like, very excited that he already thought about how he was going to present this with me. And together we worked together and said, we actually got that policy passed. And I said to him afterwards, like, thank you for taking that chance with me. I recognize you put your own reputation on this, but thank you for believing in this with me. And he was like, absolutely. And he's like, and thank you for even asking me to be a part of this. And I think, again, together, us identifying the fact that we are so different, but that could share the workload to have something go forward meant a lot. So you never know who will show up for you and how they will show up for you. This is where we have to trust people, even when it's hard and tricky, right? And lastly, I want you all to think about these things as we move forward. How many folks have had a role model of color at your school or in your neighborhoods or in your community? For some of you, you're coming from communities that are like you and as of you. That's a privilege and that's amazing. And I love that for you. But recognize that not all your peers have ever had somebody who looks like them, is like them, represents things that they have. So having a role model that represents who you are can be so important because, again, representation matters. How many have received microaggressions while at school? And this can be, we're seeing that microaggressions can have at all different levels of education to all different types of people. And you might still be thinking, I'm not sure if a microaggression happened. And that's actually how you know a microaggression probably happened. Sometimes it's those comments were like, I'm going to have to sit with this for a little bit. How many folks feel like they could report such an incident? And this is very important. I want you to think about very specifically, if you ever came through an incident where you feel like you or a friend went through something really hard, an incident where a comment was said or something physical happened, or you're like, I'm very upset right now. Who could you go to and ask for help? And think about that person. Because it's important before something happens, so we think about, if I ever had this happen to me, what would I say? And what would I do? And who would I talk to? I like to offer that advice to students so they can always be prepared if they have to be. And again, that's part of resiliency, is knowing if something were to happen, how do I, even if something bad happens, how do I come back up from this? How do I thrive through this, even if it was scary? And how often can you advocate for yourself? Again, some of you are just learning how to advocate for yourself. For some of you, you've been doing this since day one, and that's beautiful. And kudos to you, right? That's amazing. But I think that the more we have the chance to reflect on these questions, the more we can think about not only who we are, but who we want to be in this world and how we can help others in this world. Because once we set this foundation, we then can think about all of our strength, everything that we've had to overcome in life or will overcome in life. Life is not something that is planned in one straight line, let me tell you. Life has a lot of different ways of getting around and being who you are. You'll never know. But even when life is really tough, what are we going to do? And how are we going to lead in the toughest moments? Because to me, that's actually what defines us. It's not about me falling apart or having this bad moment or being really sad or feeling questioned about who I am. It's actually, how do I respond to that? And how do I continue to challenge myself and know that I'm still here and I am enough? And what will it take for you to believe that? So that's my talk for tonight. I want to make sure I leave some questions for you all to share with, things that maybe surprised you or maybe did not. You're like, wow, this is things you want to talk about. So I'll make sure I stop sharing my screen in case we have other questions.
Awesome, thank you so much. We do have a question and it says, how did you manage to code switch in college? Navigating the world of academia as a Latina feels very isolating. It truly feels like the education system was made to exclude people like me, particularly in higher ed. and I'm learning how to now rephrase that narrative.
Absolutely. So historically, we know higher education was specifically made not for people of color. I can go back as far as some of, whether it's Harvard or whether it's other institutions. The majority of these institutions were made for white cisgender males who were specifically socioeconomically rich. And I've taken a lot of history courses on higher ed. So if you feel like you don't belong, it's actually intentional. And that's actually the scariest part about this, right? Now, it doesn't mean that your specific administration doesn't care about you. It does mean that they have to be very intentional of how they include you. So for instance, we have I personally have students where they're in a medical school, pharmaceutical school. They are sometimes working against people who are working against their communities. Pharmaceutical companies are not always innocent people just trying to help give medicine. They've taken advantage, medical places have taken advantage of marginalized opportunities and communities. And so we have to understand that we are sometimes working in systems that were never meant to hold us. They're meant to harm us only if we let them harm us. Part of why I talk about self-care and resiliency is because I believe unfortunately, code switching taught me I can be in any room and I could talk to most people most days. A lot of people in my life are like, you could just really talk to anybody. I'm like, absolutely, I can. I can. And I'm very proud of that. However, I will always say, because I had to survive. Code switching is because I had to survive. When I was in a 90% rich neighborhood of white students, and they're saying a lot of disparaging comments about me growing up and saying very racialized things and homophobic things. There's a lot of lonely moments and isolated moments, but I think it was important for me to remember. I remember thinking, as soon as I get to college, I'm going to try to do something different for myself. And that's when I first found people of color who were like me, and then also separately found LGBTQ folks like me. And that's why Chosen Family has been so big for me. It's about almost finding home, right? It's finding people who would uphold me. And I recognize it takes a long time to do that. And I always talk to my students who expect to find people in their first year of school. They're like, I'll find those people then. I'm like, it took me almost 2 years into college. I was transferred. I didn't want to be there. I was like, I hate this. And then that second year, I was like, I'm going to stick it out. Stuck it out and ended up being some of my best friends for my entire life. Still friends with them. And I will be friends with them until the end. My whole point though is, even after college, I found people in my career and people who I was just like, wow, we're family. Did you see what just happened? We're family now. So you never know. You would be surprised how often you will find people. But I recognize that it's not easy. And the moment when you feel scared or isolated, it's very scary. And I think that the best advice I would have given my younger self is, remember, even when you feel alone, you're actually not. And remember to always think about the positives if you can, right? And I only say that for myself because for me, even when I'm in a really dark place or sad place, sometimes just those positive moments, I have to cling on to that just to give myself a sense of hope. Hope is to me the one thing that no one can take from me. Dreaming, no one can ever take my dreams. I understand though, for some people, you've been in a place where dreams are not available or dreams may not feel available right now, but I promise you'll be able to have that moment again. And that's really what I hope for everyone. I think if I were to say the main ingredient for my resiliency, it's hope. And writing it down, I've written my hopes. I literally have a journal from when I was 19 and I said, I will be an assistant dean by 40. And I became an associate dean at 32. And every single thing I did in my career, I knew I did it very intentionally because I knew exactly what I wanted to do and how I wanted to be. Has every dream of my life come true yet? No, not yet. But life is pretty long. And I think it's important to remember that there's a time in life for everything. So if I can't do something right now, I'll do it later in life. There's time.
Thank you. We have another question. What advice would you give to someone who isn't sure who they could go to if something bad happened to them?
Yeah, I think this is something where, it takes I want to say this, as someone who's an administrator, again, as a dean, every time a student comes forward, I actually thank them because I recognize for every student who comes forward, there's probably 5 out there who hasn't yet or is scared to come forward, right? So know this, if you have questions, you have like 10 other peers who are like, I was wondering the same thing, I just didn't want to say it. So sometimes it's about being brave and being like, let me just try to ask this. Let me just try to get it out there, because you have to be able to self-advocate for yourself in life. I always hear the thought of the adage of closed mouths don't get fed. It's true. I learned that later in life. It's true though. If you don't advocate for yourself, who's going to take care of you? You got you and only you. So you have to learn how to advocate for yourself. But that means that, right? I think one of the things is think about, is there a professor or teacher, or is there a mentor or someone at the school you feel even a little comfortable with, even just a little bit? Take a chance and see if they just test the waters, maybe asking the question in a way that's not as, specific, and seeing how they respond to it. And if they respond decently, okay, let's see if you can trust them a little bit more. If it turns out they don't give you the best answer, okay, they're not a person you're going to be able to go to. But that's how I tend to, that's what I hope for my students, is that if they can try to open up a little bit, they usually find one faculty member or one administrative person or someone on staff who can just hear them a little bit. And then that person usually is like, I see what you're saying. I'm not sure I'm the person to help you. Maybe go here. Or they're like, actually, I have all the answers. Let's talk, right? I always think of this as the worst thing that could happen is I don't ask a question and then I'm even more lost or more isolated. So I've had to teach myself really how to advocate for myself. And trust me, that's not easy. So even asking this question in front of all your peers is also good for you, because it is scary. Asking questions is really awkward.
Okay, we have this is a two-part questions. First of all, as a non-binary person, do you ever feel pressure to present a certain way as far as gender, whether in the professional or other spheres? How do you deal with that pressure? Secondly, have you ever had an experience where someone you considered part of your chosen family turned out to not be there for you and or actively tear you down? How do you deal with that betrayal?
Sure. Wow, that's a very deep question. So the first one, you know what? The world is not set up to be non-binary, right? The world is set up that gender, I mean, look at all the gender reveals, don't get me started. We started fires out in California because of gender reveals, listen. But here's the thing, right? I'm 36. I was 32 when I finally decided to really honestly open up about my gender. And I think it took a lot of me being awkward around gender. And so I'm just going to be honest. It got to the point where I was like, if I am not open about being non-binary, it's only going to hurt me. And I don't like that I had to wait to the point of it hurting me. But I think that one of the things in my region, so I'm in higher education, and in my region, I'm actually the highest level person in my career to be non-binary. So to be a dean and be non-binary, I'm one of the only at the top. There's some people, there are no non-binary presidents or vice presidents of colleges that are out, at least. So I'm the highest ranking person in my region. So there are many times where there's a lot of pressure, right? But I really try my hardest to show that not just my gender that defines who I am. I never let any one of these identities define exactly who I am. I'm all of these things and more. And so I think it's important that I dress how I feel comfortable. I dress in a way that I don't feel like I have to respond to others. And that takes a lot of courage. I used to have especially Latinas, my Latinas will understand this, used to have very long Honduran hair. The second I cut it, there were many women of color in my life who were like, your hair was so beautiful, why would you do this? And I was like, because it isn't me and I hate it. And I've been doing this because I want to make everyone comfortable, and I'm no longer doing it. So yes, there's been a lot of times in my life where there's been a pressure to please others, but it's gotten to a point, especially in my 30s, and your parents will tell you about your 30s, listen, you get to your 30s and you're like, you know what, I got to live my life for myself because no one else is going to live this life for me. And you have to be happy. Being happy is, again, a privilege, right? But I had to do it for myself and my own self of well-being. For the second part, chosen family, all families have arguments. I got into a mini argument with one of my bestest friends who is, I consider a sister. We always call each other hermana, and we always are talking about chosen family, familia. And we got in a little bit of an argument. And at the end of the day, we realized we had different definitions of what support looked like. I said, in that moment, all I wanted was this type of support. And she said, and all I wanted was this type of support. And we stopped and we thought, okay, the next time we'll do better. And we said, we're stuck with each other, so here we go. And I think it was a good moment. But this is what I do want to say about the thought of family. Remember, even with family members, you're allowed to have boundaries, and it's really important to understand that. So there might be chosen family or family related biologically or adopted family, doesn't matter. You're allowed to have boundaries of families. And some of the closest friends of mine, we actually took the chance to say, what are our new boundaries with this? And we don't say it maybe as formally as that, but we have conversations of like, so the next time we talk, how do we want to try this out? And I think that that's why they're my chosen family. A sense of betrayal, you know, it's not like people haven't betrayed me. I think I try really hard to lead in forgiveness. I always think about what did I do wrong and what could I have done better? Did I not communicate what I needed? And how can I better communicate that? And I can also acknowledge that they overstepped or did something that was wrong. And remember, things aren't only one or the other. Sometimes it can be both and. So maybe we both made a mistake and I don't have to have them in my life because it hurts right now. And maybe one day we can come back together. But boundaries are very important in friendship and family.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. If anybody has anything else to ask our lovely speaker. I'm imagining some typing happening in the background. Okay, I think that's it then. Well, thank you so much for your time, Julia. We really appreciate hearing from you. And the story is definitely powerful, and I loved how you related pieces of how while we can't always relate to everyone's experience, there's always something that we can definitely find a common ground on. And just hearing about how resiliency comes about as an individual. So thank you all for joining us tonight for the keynote for Symposium for Social Justice and Inclusion this year. We really appreciate having you all here. And thank you and have a good night.
Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.